Connecting to server. Cheers.
Okay, so we're at 3 minutes past 11. We've got 30 people in the room now, so people are still slowly trickling in. But what I wanted to do Matt said I'm going to be leading the debate. I'm really not. Okay, the debates are formed by the people that get involved in it. Really, my role here is to kind of set it up and frame it with some reference to the housing white paper, and then it's up to you guys to tell us what you think. And we've done the poll at the beginning for you all, just to kind of take the temperature of the room before we have the debate. And we're going to be doing the poll again at the end to see whether or not things have shifted at all once people have heard different views and opinions, and we've had a bit of a think about it.
If you've not voted on that yet, it should be at the bottom of your screen. We've had 27 of 29 participate so far, so a couple of people, but if you can jump on, that'd be great. So
all I'm going to do, I've got a couple of PowerPoint slides that I'm just going to run through with you, and then I'll kind of open the debate up, and Matt's going to help me because there are literally so many of you here. We don't want anybody to miss out that wants to have a say. So please, use the indicators to put your hand in the air. Matt's going to try and keep track of who puts their hand up first and make sure that we get to everybody. So please do make sure if you have something to say, let us know, and we will do our best to make sure that we get to everyone that wants to participate. It might take a little while depending on how many people want to jump in on certain areas, but we'll try and work with us, and we'll do our best for you. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Here we go. Now hopefully everyone can see that. Yeah, okay, I've got a thumbs up from Matt. Excellent. So there we go. That's just the opening slide. This is the question that we're looking at, and this is broadly speaking the poll that we've all asked you to participate in at the beginning of this debate, and then we're going to return to this a little bit later on. So how did we get here where we are now, sitting in this room having this conversation as people from around the sector? And I can see I've got Oliver Henry there, someone who works really closely with the sector. Morning, Oliver. So November 2020, Social Housing White Paper was published. Now, these are some direct quotes from that white paper. So the government said that they wanted all landlord staff to act professionally, to listen to their residents, and at all times treat them with courtesy and respect. And it's that professionalism, really, that this issue over mandatory qualifications seems to be driving towards. They wanted to establish a review of professional training and development to consider the appropriate qualifications and standards for social housing staff in different roles. And this I find really interesting, including senior staff. So they seem to be saying, heads of service, directors, assistant directors, they need to be included as part of this. And we'll come back to that point in a little bit. And then they said, as well as assessing professional requirements more broadly, including any specific customer service focused requirements, the review is also going to consider best practice for delivering support on mental health to ensure staff maintain their skills and knowledge, and if required, set out proposals for new qualifications. So there's a lot of if, buts and maybes in there, some little slightly woolly language. You might imply from that if required, set out proposals for new qualifications. Well, of course, we already have the CIH that provides a raft of qualifications that people can already do. Is the government thinking of maybe just using the CIH framework that already exists? I don't know, but I just put those questions out there for you all to consider. So what's the problem? Why is the government looking at going down this professionalisation, this qualification route? Now, what I've done here is just selected some of the cases that have hit the headlines in the last 15 to 20 years. Some of them really recent. The Rosebery case just happened in the last 3-4 months, literally this year. London and Quadrant, that was a racism damages claim, £31,000 that cost London and Quadrant. Metropolitan Housing back in 2018 cost them nearly £5,000 because they didn't listen to residents who were trying to address ASB. They just looked at the fact those residents had put CCTV up and started trying to get them to take it down without listening to the reasons why. And then Moat Housing, Harries and Hartless. Now, I've actually put the second paragraph from that judgment in my little box here because it really does set the scene. And I'll just read it out to you. So it says, on the evening of Friday, the 29th of October, 2004, it's Miss Harry's 8-year-old daughter was looking forward to joining the other brownies who'd been chosen to represent their pack on a float at the village carnival the following day. Couldn't get more quintessentially English. Her son was looking forward to his 7th birthday party the following Monday. Miss Harries had never received any notice or any other warning from her landlord that her behaviour or the behaviour of her partner, Mr. Harris, or their children was such that the family might be at risk of being evicted from their home. It was, therefore, an enormous surprise to her when her representatives of her landlord called at her house without prior notice at about 9 p.m. on a Friday, remember, 9 p.m. on a Friday, accompanied by the police and a television camera. And that was the disaster that happened in Moat Housing. So those cases collectively are probably examples of why the government is looking at do they need to impose qualifications in the social housing sector. Now, the debate, as Matt's framed it in the question, is perhaps a little bit polarised. It's a little bit black and white, a little bit yes and no. That's not a criticism of Matt. That's just how straw polls function.
I also brought everyone in, so I'm quite happy.
But so my next slide here, and this is the slide that I'm going to leave up for you to contemplate as we go into the debate and start drawing people in. There's more than one way to skin a cat, basically. So what about if we had mandatory qualifications, but you only had to have a certain percentage of staff that had a qualification? That would give you some flexibility in your recruitment practices. Now, I've said 50% there. I've just literally plucked a number out of the air. It's just to demonstrate an example of what might happen, what we could consider. What about having time restrictions placed on when you need to do the complaint by? So this exists in other areas. If you want to learn to ride a motorcycle, you do a one-day test and you get your CBT for 2 years before you have to have done your big bike test, as I call it. I know this because I ride a motorbike. So what about if you could put people on learner plates for 2 years or 1 year or a different period of time? What about if the qualifications were structured so that as you worked through the framework, it would lead to a qualification that was equivalent to a degree or a master's or an MVQ or an MBA? One of the challenges people say, oh no, if, the qualifications will just be dumbed down and they won't be taken seriously if they're tied to the sector. But what if they are accredited and certified by existing universities and other institutions? That would lend credibility to them, and that might help to lend credibility to the whole of the sector more broadly. This point about senior roles, I said I would come back to it, and here it is. I've often heard people say, oh, the finance director doesn't understand housing management, or the housing director doesn't understand asset management, or the HR director or corporate services or whatever they might be called in their various names and guises. They don't understand each other's roles. And I've had that myself. I had a director of housing whose background, he was a quantitative surveyor. And there were certain challenges there. Do we need to include senior roles in mandatory qualifications if that's the route that we go down? What about levels that match the hierarchy? So CIH operates on a scaled system. You can work your way up through the numbers. What if a CIH level 3 was matched to an officer level, CIH level 4 was matched to operational manager level, and so on, so that you could, one of the challenges when people are seeking to develop and progress up through the sector is, well, there isn't a lot of evidence that demonstrates you're ready for the next level. If you can sit there and say, well, I've done the qualification, there's some of your, it doesn't cover all bases, but there's a piece of evidence that says, I'm ready to move to the next level. And then lastly, what about modular or distance learning and phasing that in over time so that people can work their way through a qualification, run it alongside their full-time employment or their part-time employment, depending on what their hours are. That would make it more accessible and perhaps help overcome some of the barriers I know that people are concerned about, and that might prevent diversity if people have to do a qualification. If you ran the qualification alongside your daily life, your work, and if the qualifications are phased in over time, would that be something that might shift people's views on where they fall in the poll? So here we go. I will say, before we opened up the debate, Matt ran an online poll on LinkedIn, and I can't see what the results of this morning's poll are. Matt, have you got that
We've
one?
got 29 out of the 34 people in the room so far have answered the poll. So if anybody else wants to jump on and answer, please do. But so far, 10% are indicating that housing needs a mandatory qualification in every role. 63% are arguing yes for some. 10% absolutely not, and 17% aren't sure. And I think this is it's a very different kind of outcome to the poll that we've done through LinkedIn. Obviously, we've had far more people than 145 or something people that have voted on that one so far. And I think, judging by the scale of the debate and where we go with it today, I think it's interesting because obviously the points you've made, they're absolutely valid. It's whether or not we make them mandatory and how they get enforced, I think, is probably going to drive the conversation. So, Emily, thank you for sharing the slides and the ideas. Who would like to jump in first on either side of the debate? Alan Hughes, congrats, you are the first person. Do come off mute, and I know this is probably going to fill up, so do keep putting your hands up and I'm going to control that side. Yes, Emily, Matt, if you'd stay off mute, I imagine I'm going to need you throughout. Alan, over to you.
So I think for me, the first piece is what is mandatory, because I've gone through this where I work for Sanctuary Housing, by the way, so I look after all the learning development apart from our care and corporate services areas. So we have a training matrix of mandatory training, and it took about 6 months to get an agreement what mandatory is. And actually within our organisation is, if you haven't got it, you don't go to work. So there are legislative, financial or reputational implications if people don't have it. So let's say our Spark they need 18th edition, that's legislated that they need to. I think that if we say it's mandatory, then my line would be everyone has it, that's it. Otherwise it's not mandatory. It's mandatory if some people have it and some people don't, so it sort of waters down what it is. So personally, I would love to have a framework, but I would also like to take away the phrase mandatory, because as you said, Matt, unless it's enforced, what's the point? And I think that's the key bit for me, that the enforcers, if they say it's mandatory, we're going to restrict our talent pool coming in, because we're probably going to want that before we recruit people. Our current staff, who are very knowledgeable, do they have to go through the whole course again in granny suck eggs, if you know what I mean? And some people thinking, I ain't got time to do that. And the cost and time implications. So I think for me, that's the key bit. And looking at the examples that were talked about before, I don't think much of it is the frontline staff, the individuals. I think it's landlords failing their legislative responsibilities, the eviction, etc. So I don't think a housing officer having a qualification would have stopped that landlord potentially making someone evicted. So for me, it's
I wonder whether or not they would have had more, this is me talking obviously completely hypothetically, would they have had more skills to know that actually we can't do that and to push back on? I don't know. And I do completely agree with you on a lot of your points there in terms of what is mandatory. I guess the flip side of that is exactly what you've mentioned. If you don't make it mandatory, no one's going to do it.
Yeah, and that's Matt, just on the landlord side of it, I think we have our regulatory obligations. We've got ombudsmans, we've got landlord responsibilities. I think there are landlords out there that aren't doing those, and they should be punished for that, and rightly so. And that's what customers want, whether it's the individual, hardworking, grafting people within our sector. You're going to get some bad eggs as well, aren't you? I think that's enough for me, so I'll shut up now.
Thanks. No, absolutely fine. Thank you, Alan. I'm going to fly through. Tom, I think Oh, sorry, Tom, you're next. I've got you in now.
Yeah. Hi, guys. Just thank you, Matt. Just following up from what Alan said, that, I was one who voted unsure in the beginning, but I think if you look at it at the moment, the recruitment, and we've had many conversations around this table about recruitment and issues and trying to get staff on board, by putting in qualifications, are you not cutting out a massive opportunity of people who could potentially move into the sector? Or do you think that maybe we need to actually take this further and push it into education as an option where, like you can get an NVQ in this or a level 3 in that? Is there ways that you can, are there plans to push it into education, or is it something that we could start from the ground up with apprentices coming in and then slowly moving it over as the time progresses? I'm still a bit unsure. I'm still on the fence. So I just wanted to see, would those areas make any difference?
I think I'm going to actually pass back to Emily on that one, because Emily and I were discussing this just before the roundtable started. Because I agree with you. I think it's opening up an MVQ idea. One of the things, as you said, we've talked about. Kids these days go through MVQ health and social care. If there was an MVQ in housing, it would get people looking at it as a sector. But Emily, I'll pass back to you, and then I'm going to bring in Lara. Emily, you're on mute.
Oh, there we go. I mean, yeah, Matt, you're absolutely right. That was precisely the conversation that we were having a little bit earlier this morning about, does it make the housing sector more attractive as a potential employment area for children coming up through school and college and looking at what their options are? I mean, there are housing degrees. We have that already. But is it seen as a practical career option for younger people? And if that framework existed, would that make it more viable? Would it make it more attractive, more interesting for people to go into? Because they don't just see the sector, actually, they can see the ladder and the framework within the sector that they can then climb if that's what they wanted to do. So it's a really, really interesting question that you've asked there, Tom, about whether it would be, whether we would involve the education sector a lot more in upskilling the social housing sector.
And I think there's the argument there that actually then, if everyone qualified, I think someone else mentioned before about getting the role, what if you're already in it, and getting the role as you're working through is absolutely key, because then, everyone's trained to the same level was I guess is the flip side of the argument. I'm going to bring Lara in now. Just on these, by the way, I will, if there is, obviously I know there's a little bit of a queue to jump in. If you do want to immediately comment on something, please bring it in on the chat. Because Asma said that MVQ would be an idea, and I agree. And Alan, we would be potentially, if we focus on competence for all alongside the options for qualifications, I meant be better. It'd be better potentially if we focus on competencies. Agreed, but I guess if it's qualified, then it's qualified, isn't it? Lara, I'm going to bring you in. I've got you on mute.
I
was just pressing the button. Thank you for letting me speak. Excellent discussion so far. I just want to add a few things to the conversation, then I'm going to leave because I've got another meeting. I wanted to say I understand the argument that if we make qualifications mandatory, we might deter some people from joining the sector, or all the people that have come in through various means that are now really good housing people will not be accessible to us. And I completely disagree. I think that if you want to become a lawyer, you have to go to law school. If you want to become a dentist, you have to go to dentistry. If you want to become a plumber, you have to do whatever qualifications it is and be a plumber. And I think what the housing sector has suffered from is our fuzziness around what it means to be a member of the profession. There's no real definition. You can be a member of the housing profession and not be a member of CIH. You can be a member of CIH and not work in housing. So I do think that we're struggling with a lack of identifiable whatever it is of who we are. What makes you a person? What makes you a social housing person? It's almost like self-definition. I can't speak this morning.
I feel like it holds the sector as well itself to account. It makes you go, actually, I am qualified in this sector. I'm a professional of this sector.
Absolutely. And the other point I just wanted to make quickly was about compassion. And everyone that trains to be a doctor how do I put this? you need compassion in the way you deliver whatever it is you're delivering. So for those people who rocked up at a tenant's house at 9 o'clock in the evening, I mean, what were they thinking? Did they think that was there some sort of policy that says you will go at 9 o'clock in the evening? I always say to people, I have this thing I call my mum's test. If it's not good enough for my mum, why is it good enough for any tenant? And I think that should be maybe part of our professional delivery. Why would you treat a tenant or a resident any way that you would not want your mother to be treated that way? So I think there's something about common sense and compassion and caring about other people and treating people the way that you'd like to be treated. Would you want a TV crew to turn up at your house at 9 o'clock at night unannounced? Now, that's not in any policy, and no amount of professional qualification would have made that any different. I just think those people were uncaring. And the last point I'd make is about accountability. We do not have accountability in the sector. If you were a lawyer, if Grenfell was something that lawyers did, a whole bunch of lawyers would be debarred at the moment from practicing law. If Grenfell was something that accountants did, a whole bunch of accountants would no longer be accountants. If Grenfell was brain surgery and the surgeon was drunk and he did something wrong, he would not be able to practice as a brain surgeon, or he or she would not be able to practice as a brain surgeon. In housing, you can do any old rubbish, resign and get a job in another housing association. So there's no accountability. So that's the reason, personally, that I think we should have some sort of professional entry. I don't know what it is, qualification, mandatory. We need to redefine ourselves as a profession. How that is defined, I haven't got the answer yet, but that's my argument. Thank you.
No,
Thank
thank
you
you,
very,
Lauren.
very much,
Thank you
Lara.
for bringing it in. I'm going to bring out a couple of the comments, then I'm going to bring in Emily. But yeah, I think there's a lot of people agreeing with you, and I think, you know, you and I have debated this before as well. But like I say, I think there is that whole point about accountability, and like you say, if you need to be a registered member, you know, you'd never have a social worker who wasn't qualified. You'd never have any. Yeah, actually, a question Emily and I talked before this about was, do our tenants think we're qualified? And there's a big question. In terms of the chat, so Joe Lecky, I can see is chomping his bit, and I'm going to bring you in soon, Joe. Professionalism is so much more than
no problems at all.
Oh,
Maybe can
I just mute somebody there? There we are. Lovely. Professionalism is about so much more than qualifications. We already have a framework for qualifications. How do we make sure people stay current? Absolutely agree. Katie from Believe, I take the point about excluding people, but for me, it's not about creating more interest in the sector. The same with the civil service, local government, attract talent due to the perceived opportunities. I have heard many people describe as falling into the sector, and it is one of my biggest bugbears that people do. I want to make the sector more attractive, but it might get young people to see it as an option in GCSEs or MVQs, going, actually, what is that? It might get young people talking about it, but I don't know. So we said there are doctors with with really bad bedside manners. Qualification to fix this. The remit of the qualification is so important. Is it one to serve all roles, or a specialist qualification for housing management teams? Was reiterated about people falling into housing. Alan's called it the banana rama effect. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. And then I'll kind of bring in Emily on before we go through, because now these are planned up. So Emily, I'll bring you back in, then we'll jump on to Jill.
Yeah, so I think I just wanted to pick up a couple of points that have been talked about there. I mean, so just to give you a little bit of background, it's interesting what Lara was saying just there about lawyers, because I am actually a qualified lawyer. I qualified as a barrister back in 2003, and that was my first profession for 13 years. But I was always a housing specialist, and then moved over to work inside the sector back in 2016. And one of the things that you do when you qualify as a lawyer, and pretty much I think this goes across all professions, is one of the things that you have to study is ethics. And what Lara was talking about there in terms of having compassion and a sense of what's the right thing to do, you know, rocking up at someone's house at 9 o'clock on a Friday night with no notice. When you sit back and think of that from a common sense perspective, obviously that can never have been the right thing to do. And if you include ethics as part of the qualification, you know, those are the kinds of discussions that you have when you're, and I've taught ethics to other lawyers as well. And you know, the way to teach ethics is about presenting scenarios and problem cases, and how would you solve this? What would you do next? So I don't think you can necessarily separate out ethics and compassion from a more kind of knowledge-based learned professional qualification. But then taking that and looking at some of the points that Joe raises, absolutely, I've had my fair share of NHS treatment, and I've had good doctors, I've had great doctors, and I've had doctors with terrible bedside manners. Is that something that necessarily feeds into a qualification, or is that more of a performance management issue? As a manager, if you're constantly getting complaints about one of your colleagues who is being rude and is not pulling their weight and isn't doing what they need to do in the way that they need to do it, Joe's right, you're not going to solve that with a qualification. A lot of people are going to be able to tick the right boxes or on an exam paper, or do the right piece of coursework and get the qualification. We're not saying that the qualification is the be all and the end all, because obviously then you've got your system of delivery of the services within the sector. And that's where it becomes the responsibility of the sector in order to ensure that you've got the people with the right attitudes and behaviours. And that's about performance management and dealing with the people on the ground. So I think there's a number of different things coming in here that perhaps are being conflated, and maybe we need to think more broadly when we think about qualifications about what that might entail. Yes, tenancy management, in particular housing management, there's a lot of knowledge that you need to know there. You need to be able to walk through the door of a tenant's home, and when they say to you, well, my partner's left 2 weeks ago and we're separating for good and I want nothing more to do with him, but we got joint names on the tenancy, what do I do? The officer's got to be able to answer that question. That's the knowledge. They've got to be able to answer it with empathy and understanding. That's your attitudes and behaviours and your ethics as well, because there's also more than one answer to that question. So there are lots of things that feed into how we deliver services. I think qualifications, they're never going to be the only answer to improving and upskilling the sector. But could they be a part of the answer? I think is probably the real question that we're asking ourselves here.
And there's some interesting stuff on the chat that I'm going to bring Jill in, because you've been incredibly patient, Jill. So let me bring you in, and then there's a lot of really interesting ideas on both sides of the fence, as we thought there would be today. Jill, good to have you with us.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, I'm going to have a bit more of a helicopter view here. We are a broad church in housing. We weren't always, but we are now. And if you begin with the end in mind, what do? We have a critical impact on people's lives in terms of safety, property-wise, to condense it, and care, tenancy sustainability and well-being and neighbourhood, etc. So if you look at other public sector professions as an example, whether that's education or the NHS, no matter what level you come in at, you would be expected to work towards a qualification, because that's about the technical competencies required in order to be able to do all the things that Emily's just talked about there. But it would be horses for courses at different levels, and like any job role, the personal and technical competencies would be different for different roles. As for CIH, when I started, I was 16, I had 9 O-levels, and one of the reasons I started in housing was because there was that route to become a qualified professional. Because back in that day, 41 years ago, unless you had a CIH qualification, you couldn't become a manager. Every job advert requested that you had that qualification. It wasn't just a degree. There was a test of professional practice 1 and a test of professional practice 2, which is a bit like the learner plate metaphor, if you like, because you had to have a supervisor who made sure that you ticked boxes and delivered the expectations to be able to have a comprehensive helicopter view of the sector as it was at that time. For me, I'm an advocate of some jobs need qualifications from entry, others don't, and you should be able to do them day release. That would make the sector much more attractive. But you would need a qualification, or you'd need to work towards a qualification if you were a teaching assistant or a healthcare assistant. So we're not talking about backroom staff here. We're talking about people who are handling these critical impact issues, people's lives, and fronting that up for our organisations on a daily basis. Should they be having some kind of qualification or working towards a qualification? Yes. And that might sound aspirational, but I think it's the right step. We're either a profession or we're not. And we're always going to go around in circles having this argument. But because of the impact we have on people's lives in terms of safety and care, I don't think the argument against professionalism and qualified people stands up without a sector that is qualified.
And I think you're right, Jill. I think one of the key things you've said there was actually backed up by one of the comments from Joe in the chat earlier, which was that one of the attractions for the sector in the first place was that you didn't have to be qualified to get into it, but why not get qualified as you go through? And I completely agree. And actually, Asma has mentioned, who doesn't want to develop themselves? CPD is important and people take the opportunities to learn. And evidently, qualifications matter on a CV, and they do matter. And if you're trying to apply for further roles and you're qualified, it will open up more opportunities. I'm going to flick back to a point Rob made earlier before bringing in Oliver, who I've got next on the list to come through. Is Rob had mentioned, my concern is that housing has a poor relation to planning and risk surveyors. Both professions have a clear pathway of what qualifications are required and then what can be achieved. As housing has a wide range of disciplines, we need greater uniformity and consistency across the sector on professional development at all levels. And I agree, accountability is a key driver. Which is an interesting point that was made almost before some of the conversations we made before. Oliver, let me bring you in.
Oh, I've got so much I want to say, but I have to keep it.
Please feel free to.
Oh,
I'm very aware this is going to run beyond an hour today.
I'm going to preface. I'm getting really excited here. Listen to this. Now, first of all, I must admit one thing. We're a CIH centre, and we deliver a lot of accredited qualifications for CIH, but we also deliver a lot of accredited qualifications in other subjects, totally unrelated, compliance level subjects, first aid, moving and handling, prevention of violence in the workplace, customer service. And I mention those because I found Jill's comments fascinating, and I agree with her wholeheartedly. We do a job that affects people's lives. We make a mistake, it could dramatically affect someone's life. And if someone turns up at my house today to look at my boiler, I'm not guaranteed because they're qualified, they'll do a decent job, but I do expect them to at least have the basic qualifications. And I've worked in housing since May 1992. And in that time, in the last 12 years, I've trained literally thousands of people, as Emily knows, literally thousands of people.
Including me.
Yeah, including Emily. Yeah, so thousands of people. And I'm always fascinated in housing, how many members of staff, how many people in teams have little or very limited knowledge of housing, despite having worked in the sector for a number of years. They work in silos completely. When I speak to my friends outside of housing, and I say that you could become a director of housing, you could be, and have no housing qualifications whatsoever, they just laugh. They just laugh. They say that's not a profession. You can't fall into becoming an accountant. You can't fall into becoming a planner. You don't fall in accidentally to become a solicitor or plumber or electrician, but you can fall into housing and stay in it for a number of years and get right to the top. And that's why you have the lack of empathy. Some of the decisions we talked about earlier, yes, it is to do with individuals. But if someone turns up 9 o'clock at night, that isn't one person's decision, is it? That's a series of decisions by a number of people. And no one in that chain has realized, hold on, this is not professional. Now, I'm taking Joe's comment. Now, I know a lot of qualifications don't guarantee professionalism. It isn't the be all and end all. I appreciate that fully. But surely we should have basic qualifications for the profession that we work in. Otherwise, my view is not a profession. It's a thing that people do.
It's a really interesting one, Oliver, because as you say, that I completely agree with. But on the flip side of it, nearly everybody in this room today fell into housing. And well, I guess that's the flip side. You don't want to restrict those opportunities, I guess, for those who do fall into it.
So, Matthew, I think there is...
I'm just playing devil's advocate. I'm not saying I agree or disagree.
I think there's a solution, though. The solution is you upskill existing staff. And in many jobs, for example, I've got a trainer who's just started here. They have to have subject knowledge, pass the subject knowledge. They have to have their teacher training, basic qualification, AET level 3, level 4 to train. And you have to do that at university. I taught at Birmingham City University for 4 or 5 years as a guest lecturer. You have to have basic qualification. So you say, come into the field. I know your expertise is in this area, but in the next couple of years, I want you to work towards this qualification. So you don't stop people coming in, but you say once they come in, within a certain amount of time, they work towards a certain qualification. Now, at the moment, if you take apprenticeships, for example, a level 2 apprenticeship in housing, for example, is property management assistant. And then the officer level is like a level 3. Then a senior officer goes from level 4 upwards. Work towards a qualification, but don't stop people coming in, because what makes housing brilliant, I think one of the strong points of housing is having people come from other sectors and with that experience. But I think upskilling staff is one option, and also really encouraging people to work towards a qualification is another one. But the whole idea of just carrying on and saying it won't make a difference, qualifications won't make a difference and so on, it will make some difference, because I think we as a sector make incredibly poor decisions on many occasions. And we were doing some ombudsman training recently, and sometimes, not being rude, but sometimes I train members of staff and I despair at the comments that come back to me. And I sometimes want to ask them why they're working in housing. And I think, they should go work in some other sector. And I've actually said that a couple of times, but even so, I think there are so many things we can do, but certainly baseline qualifications surely would be a good start. I'm going to stop there. I've got loads more.
No, thank you, Oliver. I really appreciate it. If it wasn't for the amount of people, I'd say we could talk all day. So absolutely love it. I will come back to some of your points in a minute. I'm going to bring in Joe Simcox, just because I've got a list of people to jump through. So Joe, let me bring you in.
Yeah, hi all. I think for me, I sit on the fence a bit, really. I understand that we need some sort of framework. I've just jotted down here, framework of best practice with competencies and the practice versus theory, I guess, of that framework. Picking up on Joe Lecky's observation is you can't train culture, you can't train soft skills, you can't train compassion. As well as, with Lara's point of bringing in, there are absolutely skills and accountability aspects. And I think it's thinking about the housing sector, it's wide varied. So I'm head of customer experience. It's, the arguability for that sort of role within housing is, do you need a housing qualification to be that head of service? You need an understanding of housing. So it's thinking about that. Why we are a sector with that huge wide ranging pieces. So is it that we need sort of, following that framework of having like safeguarding needs? So do we within every organisation, picking up on that poll at the start of this, do you need almost like those named people, for want of a better phrase, that are responsible for X, Y, and Z decisions in the within the industry, within that organisation, to ensure that the right actions are being taken and we're not turning up to evict someone at 9 o'clock at night. And then I think just the last one is making sure we're not excluding people. So picking up on Asma's point earlier about that CPD process is, someone who, when I was in my younger days, hated doing anything formal, hated doing any sort of training, but demonstrating through that CPD process, they are building up that level of experience to build up into that accountability, to then lead into doing some sort of professional qualification that matches the expectations. And I think it's just making sure we're being aware of those expectations within CPD. It's providing that framework of responsibility.
Completely agree. And I think that, Emily, I'll jump back to you in 10 seconds, but my point now is exactly that, which is you can be qualified in something. For example, my girlfriend's a qualified nurse, but that doesn't mean she's immediately allowed to do everything. She's had to get stuff signed off and trained up and through. And again, that's signed off on your CPD, but had to have that base qualification to know that you've got the core competencies. Emily, let me bring you back in.
I was just going to say, because I think Joe is the first person to talk about continuing professional development and CPD, because I think there is a wider point there, and perhaps this is a whole separate discussion, but you can have your baseline qualifications, you can, whether it's an MVQ type thing, whether it's the existing CIH, whatever it might be. But just because you've gone and got that certificate, it doesn't mean that you're done, that you stop learning. I mean, you look at the frequency of changes that happen within the housing sector, and we've got legislation going through at the moment looking to, apply the decent home standard to the private sector. We had the introduction of the housing health and safety rating system back in 2004. EPC standards changed very, very recently, and may potentially change again. There's case law coming out all the time about the application and the implications of the Equality Act and human rights, disabilities, and so on. And the rate of change that happens in this sector is phenomenal. And so you can't do a certificate one day and expect that that's going to qualify you for the rest of your career. So I do wonder whether we need to be having a parallel conversation about, all right, let's look at creating baseline consistent levels of knowledge and understanding as a starting point. But then how do you build a framework that ensures that people continually refresh and revise and review the knowledge that they have? And I'm talking about knowledge. I know I talked about ethics earlier, and that's part of a qualification. But you need some knowledge in order to be able to operate the ethics, because the ethics sit within a framework. So yeah, that continuing professional development is a really, really important point to think about as well.
100%. And it's that we talk mandatory qualifications, but if you're going to be a manager, you should be qualified.
Yeah, and lots of professions have mandatory CPD. Barristers have to do a minimum of 12 hours a year. I mentioned that one, it's just the one that I know about.
They
but similarly,
NHS.
doctors, dentists, anything. And I want to know, someone who's going to go anywhere near any part of my body, that I want to know that their knowledge is up to date and on point. And similarly, the roof over people's heads, it's possibly one of the most important aspects of anybody's day-to-day life. And we're talking about officers who have the power to take that roof away, potentially. And it's really important that we know that the people making those decisions on a day-to-day basis are really up to date in what is the current best practice and application of the decisions or the information.
And that's where the qualification stuff sometimes is difficult, is keeping that knowledge up to date. Yeah. But interesting point. A lot of the things in the comments seem to be that balance between ethics and professionalism and then the knowledge base. But as Hannah Harvey mentioned, if you look at the European model, you cannot work with vulnerability if you're not qualified. Arthur Tassang, I'm going to bring you in.
Hi, yeah, thank you. It's really, really interesting conversation, and it's something that we're talking about at my organisation. And almost in a sense, they're probably the same, but it's understanding whether we talk about professionalisation or qualification, because I think the two are, I think Joe mentioned it, they're interlinked, but they're also very separate. I think it's really easy to say, oh, that person's qualified, therefore they must be better at doing the job that they're being asked to do. And I think that sometimes can create an arrogance within certain areas of housing. I've worked across local authority and now in the housing association, and there is sometimes an issue whereby you may have somebody that's got a qualification in your assets team, and you're speaking to them about an adaptation that's needed to help somebody stay in their home, and that person says, well, under equalities, we've got no legal obligation to do that, and I'm professional and I'm the qualified person, therefore I'm saying no, therefore you are now, you're being a bit flighty, a bit airy, that's lovely, but that's not what the law says. And I think we sometimes run the risk there. I've put in a comment, I think for me, to have some sort of framework, a national across all housing associations framework that said, these are the qualifications, these are the professionalization, sorry, I can't speak now either. These are the professional qualities that you need. These are the things that we need to be able to see you demonstrate. And this is the time that we need you to do it. So, every 6 months, every 12 months, everybody that works frontline in the housing association should have to go through a collective mandatory customer experience training, a safeguarding training, and not just based on the whim of the housing association you work for or the manager you have or what your personal passion is. Because that's why I see, if you think about teachers, they have to go on teacher training days where they have a very strict framework of things that they have to go through, so that your child, whether that teacher is in your local authority or another local authority, has the same baseline. And I think personally that would be my preference than making it a mandatory qualification. And
it's what's really interesting as well, Arthur, and they're really, really good points that you make there. But we have codes of conduct already. The CIH has a code of conduct. The NHF has a code of conduct. And it talks about the ethics of your decision making. And so it's not as though we're a sector without frameworks or qualifications or codes of conduct or all the rest of it. We have a lot of this stuff there. But has the time now come where we need to take those existing frameworks and actually start applying them nationally, as Arthur was talking about, and creating that consistency in terms of, you know, baseline knowledge that other people were talking about previously, and someone did mention the word consistency previously. I'm really sorry, I can't remember who it was, but that I did hear that word talked about. You know, and are we missing a trick here? Have we got all the stuff in place? It's just a matter of rolling it out and making it more widely known and publicizing that this is who we are and this is what we do as a sector.
And I think what's clear is the fact we're not ever trying to say, if you're not qualified, you can't work in it, you can't even get a foot in the door. It's about once you're in, you will be expected to qualify in some level of qualification because it's necessary. And actually, an interesting point there from Nasha mentioned earlier, attitude is essential, and you can't train people to actually care. You just can't do it. So regardless of qualifications, you can't train people to actually just care. Joe Leckie, I'm going to bring you in.
Hang on. Right. No, interesting point, Matt. You can't train people to actually care, but what you can do is remind people why they're doing the jobs they do and actually remind them that why they came into the sector. Because when you ask people, the majority of people, why do you work in this sector? They'll say because they want to make a difference, but actually then go about in their day jobs not making a difference. So it's about reminding people why they're doing the job they do. And it's the culture of the organisation often, isn't it? It's the way you do things around here. So if you're not being modelled, if the way isn't being modelled for you, and I did a LinkedIn post about this when I first joined the sector and worked in a local authority. Even though I am passionate about good customer service and I'd worked in 5-star hotels before I joined the housing industry, so passionate about good customer service, I fell in with the pack, if you like, because of the culture of where I worked. I went against every principle that I'd got in order to be accepted by the people I worked with, because if I didn't behave that way, I was bullied. That's what happened, essentially. I started to get bullied because I was different. And I got told, Joe, can you stop having good ideas because it gives us more work to do? And I thought, eventually, what am I doing here? Because ultimately, this is going against all of my ethics. Ethics is a good word. It's going against them, all of my values. And that's when I moved away into housing associations rather than local authorities, because it was a toxic environment where I worked. And so I think it's so much more. And I joined without any qualifications at all. If I'd have needed qualifications, I wouldn't have been able to join. So
I know have you embraced qualifications though, as you've gone through?
Yeah, absolutely. But if I'd have needed them, I wouldn't have been able to join. And I joined as a housing assistant. So and I agree with that. And I sort of had my own career structure. So I joined as a housing assistant. And when I wanted to become a housing officer, I started studying so that I could prove that I could do that. And so I agree. We have to have some sort of structure, but don't let it stop people getting into the sector, because you'll lose some really good people if you do that. And having been a recruiting manager for many years, I know I've often recruited on the basis of people's behaviours rather than their qualifications, because I want the right people in my team with the right behaviours. I can teach them, I can mentor them, I can get them qualified, but I need them to have the right behaviours at the outset.
Joe, I completely agree with you. Completely agree with you about attitudes and behaviours. One of the best housing officers I ever recruited was an art gallery manager before he became a housing officer in the team I was heading up, and he's going great guns today, and is a team leader now. So you know, it really does go to show. But just drawing some threads out of the chat, Emma Lindley's made the point that, you know, we already have so much in the sector in terms of these qualifications in this framework and the codes of conduct. So what, you know, why aren't we using that? And just taking some of the threads that have come out of this discussion and drawing them together a little bit and raising a parallel about, because one of the questions that Matt and I were talking about was, well, okay, the government have decided they're going to look at qualifications in the housing sector. And if we don't do something, and I've been saying this to Oliver Henry for years, if we don't do something as a sector, the government's going to do it to us, and then we won't have a choice. And we've got an opportunity now. There's a consultation that's currently live. The press release went out in January of this year from the department. I don't think a lot's happened on it because we've had more housing ministers than hot dinners so far in the last few months. And I think those changes have held up a lot of what the DC, I can't remember the initials now, but whatever, the Department for Housing and Levelling Up in Communities and so on, what it's been trying to do, a lot of that's been stymied by all of those changes. But way back when, not the current round of, let's impose right to buy, but kind of 10, 15 years ago, when the government was looking at extending the right to buy into housing associations, and the NHF negotiated with the government, and they reached a voluntary settlement. And I wonder whether there's an opportunity now for the sector to come together, to coalesce behind a consensus view about what we think the qualifications should be, how they should be phased in, what period of time people can do them over, making sure that it doesn't create barriers for, you know, diverse people to access the sector, take all of those things and present a kind of an oven-ready framework. Oven-ready reminds me of Brexit, won't go down that way, but present an oven-ready framework to the government and say, look, we'll do this ourselves. Now, arguably, to stop the kind of the consultation and the scrutiny that's happening by the government now, we did have an opportunity to do this previously, and we haven't done it. So we've kind of got ourselves into this position, arguably. But should we now, do we now need to come together, find a place of consensus and present something to the government and say, look, we're the sector, we're the specialists, we know what we need to do, we have the qualifications, we have the codes of conduct, let us roll this out and we can do this.
It's really,
I'm putting that one out
interesting
there.
one exactly on that, Emily, because at the same time Robert put in the chat, is there an issue with the housing sector being fragmented across the LAs and RP functions with competing professional organisations? CIH, NHF, HQN, has this diluted the offer around qualifications and professionalism? It's certainly a really interesting point. Alison Leach, I'm going to bring you in, and then I've got Richard Brampton just after you.
Hi everyone. We've covered a bit of this in terms of thinking about CPD and keeping up to date. But my qualification, for example, is 25 years old. Is there going to be any kind of passporting, or do we think that people who've had qualifications for that length of time is maybe not fit for purpose and they need to start again? I haven't got the answer, but I think we need to think about whether there's what kind of accreditation for prior qualification or passporting that we're going to lobby to be applied to this.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good point, Alison, about, you know, the length of time some people have had their qualifications, and, you know, how can we ensure that those people do stay up to date? Passporting as well, it's another interesting point, you know, because there are people who work in other sectors, social workers, for example, who a lot of their knowledge can be applied to the housing sector, particularly when dealing with vulnerable residents, perhaps in supported or sheltered housing. So, you know, if people want to cross over from other sectors into housing, can they use some of their existing qualifications as a kind of an accreditation system to say, well, actually, I've already done this module of, I'm plucking stuff out the air now. I've already done the vulnerable or supported housing module of CIH level 4 because I've got my social workers qualification. You know, could we do some cross-sectional passporting like that in order to facilitate movement between sectors and get more talent into social housing? Again, it's just another question that I'm putting out there.
I really appreciate your point there, Alison. It's an absolutely brilliant one. Richard, I'm going to bring you in.
Thanks very much, Matt. Right, as someone said earlier, there's loads you could say on this, but I'll be trying to be as brief as I can. We all got mandatory training in our organisations, and so if you get consistency across that, there's X amount that then you've got already, and then qualification is a separate thing. Someone also mentioned about accountability. If you're an accountant, and we've all got them in our organisations, you're a member of an accounting body. The difference is that we haven't got that consistently across our organisation. So if there's membership to a trade body, CIH perhaps, for example, that's different to qualification, but that then gives that accountability that if you do something that is not considered suitable for a member of that body, there is that accountability to the trade body. So you couldn't go off and get another job somewhere else in another organisation, perhaps. So I think membership and qualification, again, it's two separate things. and you could make sure that membership, if you were a member, we're talking about these baseline things, whether that's part of the mandatory training in each organisation or MVQs that were mentioned, that within, let's say, the first year of your membership, you get to whatever level is decided. I'm on the CIH Professional Standards Committee. One of our roles is looking at complaints against CIH members. I've been on that committee for 3 years. Anyone want to hazard a guess at how many complaints I've investigated in that time? It's a big fat zero, because they're not brought to us. One, now, is everyone doing a great job? Well, let's hope they are. But two, if you do something internally, there's nothing in my organisation's procedures that say, oh, by the way, check they're a CIH member and go and grass them up to CIH. So there isn't that accountability that way either. And I think that's half the sticking point. And there was probably something else, but I've forgotten. Oh yeah, sorry, that's the last one. Is then what type of qualification? I'm head of income, so I want people to be able to collect money, and is actually something probably outside of housing that is probably the best qualification for us. So again, it's being clear what qualification would be needed for each type of role, and again, consistency in that. So again, as some sort of framework of what would be acceptable would be needed. I think that's it. Thank you.
No, I'm going to bring, there's a couple of points in the chat. I'm going to bring Emily in, then it's Hannah, and then I'm going to Wayne. But Jo's mentioned her level of membership of the Australian professional housing body is dependent on her CPD. And I know there was a chat earlier on actually saying, I think Lara brought it up, that, I think Asma mentioned you need to do your 20, 21 hours of CPD a year to work in housing. But if you don't do it, nothing happens. And then Alan Hughes has mentioned, would ethics potentially be brought into question if an organisation who recommends to government what the solution might be, however, provides the solution? And I think, again, it's this whole piece that's so important around accountability, but also just making sure that we're proud to be professional in the sector that we work in. And I think, actually going, I'm qualified in X because this is what I specialise in and this is what I do. And so many people fall into housing but work in it all their lives. Let's talk about that more openly in terms of with the wider public about how important it is that and how proud we are to be qualified in what we're doing. Emily.
Yeah, and I think there's another layer really that Richard's kind of added onto the discussion that we were already having. And it just made me think while he was talking, when we send out complaint resolution letters, you have to have that mandatory text at the bottom that says, if you want to escalate it to the next level, here's what you need to do. Or if you're at the top level and you want to escalate it to the ombudsman, here's how you contact them. What if, in addition to if you want to escalate it to the ombudsman, here's how you contact them, you could say, and if you want to make a complaint against an individual member of staff, you can refer them to the CIH for disciplinary action. What if the ombudsman could refer, because when ombudsman complaints go in, everybody knows you have to send all the paperwork to the ombudsman, and they spend hours and hours and hours going through all of that paperwork to make sure they've understood a case properly. If they found something in that casework that they thought, oh, actually, that's a bit sharp practice, the ombudsman refer officers over to the CIH disciplinary panel. Do we need to start looking? Everyone's talked about accountability and holding ourselves to account. And do we need to make ourselves more open? Do we need to make it easier for residents to be able to say, well, actually, it's not just about the landlord as an umbrella name, it's about an individual officer. Do we need that level of accountability within the social housing sector? And I think when we look at qualifications, they do go in hand, because you kind of go, well, actually, you pass this qualification based on this, you should know this. Hannah Harvey, I'm going to bring you in.
Thanks, Matt. This has been fascinating. I didn't join till late, so thank you. It's been really interesting, but just a few points from me. I think housing sometimes is its own worst enemy. So whilst it is incredibly fantastic that we talk about the fact we fell into the sector, we've stayed here for forever, we love it, it doesn't always actually help us, because it actually makes us seem quite unprofessional externally when people talk about falling into it and it not choosing it as a career. So I sometimes think that our narrative of it's an amazing career to fall into doesn't particularly help us long term, because how can you then say to people you have to qualify if you've got lots of people saying I fell into it? I think we don't always help ourselves. I think secondly as well, just thinking about the region that I work in, which is the east of England, I know of 4 CEOs in East of England who are not chartered members, who are not even CIH members. They not have anything. Now, that is very difficult if at the top of an organisation you have somebody sitting there that doesn't model the need to, 1, be a member, or 2, do any sort of ongoing professional qualification or align themselves to anything that shows they are willing to do that. I know that's not the case everywhere. I know people like Jill is a very good example of that, because I know for Jill it was super important. She maintained it. And for myself, for example, the first thing I did when I became an exec was get myself chartered, because I thought it was so fundamentally important that I modelled that for the rest of my organisation. But there's something what we're not doing quite correctly, where we've got people sitting really high up organisationally, where they are not willing to put themselves on the line to either get that qualification or show the rest of the sector that they're prepared to do it. And sometimes I think it's a bit about ego, that I got here without needing to do it, so why do I need to do it now? Which isn't particularly helpful, and one of my big bugbears. I think, as well as the only other thing I would say as a sector, is we are desperately trying to reshape our narrative about how we support our tenants. We've had an awful year with some really horror stories coming out from the media, obviously, which we're all very well aware of. Now, if we cannot see the complete interlinkage with being qualified and having a professional qualification and understanding a good tenant experience, then there is something significantly and fundamentally wrong within the sector. So we have to really find a way of getting people to understand that those two are so intrinsically interlinked. We are never going to change the external narrative about how our sector is perceived outside of the people that work with it. We all love it because we do it, and we know how hard we all work, and we know there's fantastic peoples within housing. However, everybody looking in right now is thinking, well, what are you all doing? You're doing a crappy job, actually, because you're not really doing what you should be, because look at all the complaints that are coming through. We've got to rechange that. We've got to change that narrative. And I think the only way to do that is often, unfortunately, when people from the top model it down. And I can categorically say, from my experience in the East of England region, that isn't something that I see. I don't know about the rest of the country. And I think we've really got to try to focus on all levels, not just entry levels. So we've got some people that come into the sector exec director level. There's nothing wrong with that. That's an absolute legitimate way to enter. But when they get here, there absolutely should be a requirement that person has some form of qualification to make sure that that trickles all the way down through the rest of the organisation. Sorry,
No, absolutely. I think it goes back to a point Emily made earlier, actually, was exactly that, which is, why does my FD not know how housing management works? Exactly. And Emily, I know this came up on your presentation in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I can think of a couple of organisations. It's not a comment on how they're doing as organisations. I mean, if you look at Octavia, for example, their current director with responsibility for housing management came into housing from British Airways. The current chief operating officer at Shepherd's Bush Housing Association used to work in the utilities sector. So it's that, and they will have leadership skills. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have got those jobs at all. Of course, they will bring something to the table in terms of strategy and digitization and leadership skills and all of that. But housing is a really tightly regulated sector with lots of complex, overlaying, interacting pieces, like a game of chess in many ways. And you need to spend the time to learn about what you're dealing with and what you can and cannot do. I mean, when I first started in my current role back in November 2019, and my boss started about a week before me, and one of the first, and he'd never dealt with housing management before, one of the first questions he asked me was, why can't we serve a notice seeking possession when someone's a penny in rent arrears? And it was that level of learning and understanding, and over time, he picked it up, he picked the knowledge up. But I think, to me, that's a demonstration of actually why it's so important, not just for officers doing the day-to-day work with the residents, but for leaders up and down an organisation to ensure that they have the knowledge and the understanding, to understand the parameters within which they can operate. Because if you don't understand those parameters in such a tightly regulated sector, your risk of overstepping a line somewhere and getting into hot water is increased, hugely. So that's my personal experience. That's my contribution there. And I know, just to say, Matt is running the poll again. We did the poll at the beginning, where we asked,
see if there's any difference.
Do we need mandatory qualifications? So if you haven't yet, please do answer the poll. Just to give you a recap, and it would be interesting to see where the numbers have landed at the end of this. So Matt's LinkedIn online poll, we had 13% as yes for mandatory qualifications for all roles, 40% as yes for some roles, 38% as absolutely not, and 9% were undecided. So that was pre-debate online. At the beginning of this session, just after 11 o'clock, the results were 10% as yes for all roles, so a slight reduction from online. Overwhelming 63% as yes for some roles, 10% as absolutely not, and 17% were undecided. Now,
we haven't got anybody undecided so far. Well, I'm going to let that run because I've got Oliver, and then I've got Wayne to bring in, and then I know Lara had put on, but I don't know if you still point to raise, Lara. So Oliver, let me bring you in, and then I'm going to go to Wayne from Rematch.
Yeah, just very briefly, I really liked Hannah's comments there, Hannah Harvey. Just one thing, when I started in housing, I had a really brilliant manager, got a name checker, Kath Madison. I worked for a local authority in Northampton at the time. And I don't know where Kath is now. I think she's retired by now. But she said to me, as soon as I started in housing, I was 24. And she said to me, I want you to be good at your job, Oliver. We liked your attitude. We liked your behavior in the interview. But you know nothing about housing. So I'm going to send you on a learning journey. It was a national certificate in housing, I think, back at the time at Milton Keynes College. But you're going to do that alongside learning the job. And that's always made me biased about the learning journey, the academic learning journey, alongside actually getting it done. And I think the two, there is an inextricable link between the two that really helps you become effective and very good at your job. And as I said earlier, being good at your job really makes a difference when you're affecting people's lives. So I did fall in, as Hannah said, into housing. But once I got into housing, I wanted to do it like I meant it and do it really, really well, because I knew how important it was to those who were subject to the decisions I might make or influence. So I think
you have to have the education in order to do that.
Great.
I absolutely agree. You have to have the education. It's funny, actually, Joe's mentioned that she thinks you worked in the same place, Oliver, where you did your BTEC at the same time at Milton Keynes College. So there you are. Is housing? There's always a connection somewhere. Wayne, if you're still here, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, hi Matt, how are you? Okay.
I'm good. Cheers.
Yeah, so yeah, obviously brilliant conversation. Oliver and Arthur, obviously I agree with quite a bit of the stuff obviously you guys have said. I didn't fall into property in the housing sector, so I came into it at 17. So I've pretty much been in it all my working life. I'm 37 now. Personally, I believe mandatory qualifications, I don't believe are going to do anything. Mandatory training, I believe obviously everybody should have. Coming through the private rental sector, having my own estate agents, letting agencies. Obviously, we're now working with Room Match. There's a huge lack of understanding with obviously the tenants that we're actually working with. So mandatory training for all staff, I believe, to get a better understanding of the tenants that we're working with is a must. So we're pushing obviously for that training now. So we've got a meeting on the 19th with the Department of Levelling Up through obviously what we're doing and obviously the points that we want to start to make. We've seen obviously a lack of support staff within supported accommodation as it is. If people do mandatory qualifications, that's obviously going to drop. And obviously the sector then is going to go into further strain than currently what it is already. So yeah, mandatory training to get an understanding of the tenants that we're with, obviously is where it needs to be going. But then again, obviously the understanding of the tenants actually coming through. We've got a lack of understanding of the tenants actually coming into to our types of accommodation. So me personally, obviously we work with a lot of supported accommodation providers. Where you've got need types in the property, you've got mental health, you've got domestic violence, you've got drug dependency, homelessness, all in one property. It doesn't work. So what is the qualification of a member of staff having across that broad? It's just not going to work. So the whole aspect of social housing needs to be readdressed, really. It needs to go back to the drawing board and personally start again. We need to have a better understanding of the tenants coming into the sector, and then say that mandatory training for the support workers that are actually delivering that service. Obviously, the point where the eviction happened at 9 o'clock on one of the evenings, I work with a lot of private landlords. Sometimes it's out of our control if there's a repossession happening. I've known repossessions happen at 1 o'clock in the morning, 12 o'clock at night, 3 o'clock in the morning. So a repossession will happen on behalf of the landlord through Birmingham Insured, Virgin Money, whatever it may be, repossession of the property. So we've got to look at the understanding of why that person was evicted rather than just going, it was the landlord that evicted. So obviously there's still a load of issues around there. The landlord could have done everything he could have done to prevent that from happening. Once it goes to repossession contract, obviously it's out of that landlord's hands. So again, obviously, if it is down to something small with the landlord just doing an eviction through late payment of rent, whatever it may be, yes, it is wrong. but obviously we've got to look at the understanding of why that happened in the first place.
Well, obviously, I mean, when the adjudication came through, they were obviously found to be incorrect and went through those. And I think that, you know, some really interesting points. Emily, you probably got a response to a couple of those points.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be very, very surprised to hear if legitimate court bailiffs are operating at 1 and 3 in the morning. That I would query the lawfulness of those evictions, and if the landlords are doing them themselves or they're subcontracting to agencies that perhaps aren't employing the necessarily strictly legal methods. That sounds very, very strange to me. I do think, though, Wayne, you make an interesting point there about differentiating between mandatory qualifications and mandatory training. And I think training really is a form of education, and qualifications is almost a way of proving and demonstrating that you've undergone the training and you've had the education and then it's sunk in to some level or degree. And so I wonder whether, Wayne, you're not actually very far away from saying that you might potentially be supportive of mandatory qualifications, because actually what the qualification would do would demonstrate and prove that your colleagues and the people that work in your teams have undergone the mandatory training that you're so very keen on making sure that they've undertaken and delivered, so they know how to do their job. So I heard what you said, Wayne, but I wonder whether actually you're not so very far away from perhaps even becoming a supporter of a qualification.
Let's find out. Lara, I know you have one last point. You had raised your hand earlier. I didn't know if you said a last point you wanted to make before we... No, you're okay. That was... intense. I'm aware it's 12:15 and a lot of people having to go.
It was. I just one final point, Matt. I've just totted up the statistics from the poll that we did at the beginning of the session and the poll that we've done at the end of the session. And the major shift has really been nobody is sitting on the fence anymore. And there's been a 20% shift into, yes, mandatory qualifications for all roles. So that's really where the shift has gone. People sitting on the fence, and some of those people that were saying yes, but only for some roles, seem to have fallen into the yes for all roles box. So that's the direction of travel currently, which is fascinating. But what I've got these stats written down, so I'll do a little table and we can pop it up.
I think, as we've said, the important thing is how they get delivered. I think that's been the key thing that's come out today is, yes, it's mandatory, but how long you're in a role before you must be qualified and those kind of things. And it's not about being qualified before you walk into the sector, but it's making sure that once you're in, you are then educated to the point where you are a qualified professional.
And I suspect, as with all these things, Matt, I suspect the devil will be in the detail.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's weird, we've lost half the participants before the final thank yous, but really, really appreciate today. Next week, I've actually got Claire Patterson with me, and we're discussing basically, does social housing have too much data? So it's going to be a very different discussion, but still an interesting one. But for now, thank you, everybody. Emily, thank you for helping chair that with me. I couldn't have done it without you.
Thank you for inviting me, Matt. Thoroughly enjoyed myself. And thank you, everybody, for participating so enthusiastically and passionately. That's one thing that really came across, is people's passion. It's great.
And it's brilliant. Thank you, everyone. I will speak to you all again soon. Cheers.